Russia is moving towards a full-blown centralized command economy. Now, this, of course, reminds us of the old Soviet-style command economy, but this new one could be marketed as Russian tradition. Let's call it Tsarist. For over 1,000 years, you had the aristocracy ruling over Russia, and so maybe that's going to be the sales pitch this time, right? So you have this nobility, you have the ruling class, and then you have the serfs below that who have to work until they drop dead. So you don't have to call it Soviet, you don't have to call it communist, you don't have to call it Marxist-Leninist. Maybe there's going to be some marketing to placate some of the older leftists in Russia, and maybe to placate international socialist circles to kind of maintain those international connections. But they could call it National-Bolshevism. They can, even though it's very close to historical fascism, Russia could call it Russian National-Bolshevism. Problem solved, right? They can brand it as Christian. They could brand it as Roman style, right? So Russia today now considers itself to be the third iteration of the Roman Empire, the third Rome. And Rome had sort of a command economy, and a lot of it was secret, so people didn't get actual true numbers. Now, Western politicians and business bosses, they acted really surprised when the Ukraine war happened. They professed that they were being optimistic that Russia would develop into a normal country, something that is closer to the West. So, and because of that optimism, there was all this trade with Russia, and there was also this political appeasement with Russia. But unfortunately, that all didn't quite work out. However, even in 1999, Western experts, I'm going to quote you the exact one on that, Western experts understood that Russia was not moving towards normalizing, towards becoming a normal country. Quite the opposite. It was just a transition phase, and we, the West, were subsidizing that Russian transition, and it would likely end up in another command economy. In 1999, you had a text released by Clifford G. Gaddy from the elite American think tank Brookings. And they talked about what they called Russia's virtual economy. So what they mean by that is a lot of these economic processes in Russia are quite crazy, and they don't create profits. They don't create more value. So a lot of corporations, a lot of facilities in Russia, they produce goods, but what they produce is not worth as much as they needed to put into production. That is the opposite of what you would have in real capitalism, where a corporation finds ways to make interesting, useful products, and you make it somewhat cheap so you can sell it with a profit, and then you can reinvest those profits, or you can have fun with them. And so classic capitalist procedures is what caused the Americans, for example, to become such an economic powerhouse, to produce all the bits and pieces for society and for the military. So it's not a big problem for the Americans to produce new tanks and rockets and missiles and airplanes, because there's so many companies that make the microchips, and they make all the little bits and pieces and all these complicated bits and pieces. Whereas Russia failed miserably in the Ukraine war because Russia can't make all the little bits and pieces and the complex military goods. So for a long time, Russia bought these parts and pieces from Ukraine, but in 2014 that stopped. It was a ban on further exports, and for a while Russia's elite proclaimed they could start making all this stuff themselves, but of course they could not. Many factories in Russia really operate at a loss. They don't make profits. They don't make products that are competitive compared to international products. So usually you would shut down these factories, but Russia chose to keep them open and to keep them running. And of course, then you had to hide all those losses, the destruction of value, instead of creating new value. And how did they manage to hide all this economic destruction? Well, by avoiding money transactions. So usually you would assume, just like in many Western countries, transactions happen with money. So companies pay their taxes to the government using money. Large corporations buying certain goods with money and that sort of thing. But in Russia, there has been a trend of demonetization. So that means the government accepts certain goods and products as tax payments, and even large corporations accept physical goods as payment. And that gives many opportunities to hide the true value of something and to hide real prices. Right? It's a simple basic technique, but that's been going on for a long time. And it kind of reminds us of the old Roman Empire, where the upper class took the grain from the lower class, and that grain was considered money. And then at higher levels of government, that grain was converted into little gold droplets. They called them solidi. So they were not elaborate coins, they were these little blobs of gold. Now, of course, if these blobs don't have serial numbers, if these grains don't have serial numbers, if there's no clear, transparent auditing chain, you could steal all kinds of stuff and you could hide the true numbers and the true value. Clifford Gaddy from Brookings said in 1999, up to 70% of transactions between corporations, up to 70% of these transactions avoid the use of money. And so it's the same kind of thing with tax payments of large corporations. So it's all physical goods and bartering instead of money. A long time ago, a man called Hermann Rauschning kept confronting Adolf Hitler with his worries about the Nazi economy. And the Nazi economy was a complete mess. It tried to be like the Roman Empire, and it has certain parallels with Russia's economy today. And every time Hitler was confronted with these legitimate concerns, Hitler would blow them off and stress the point that as long as you kept consumer prices somewhat stable, the population would accept pretty much anything. So no matter how much they have to work or how little economic growth they actually have and that sort of thing, they would accept anything if you package it in an ideological way. They would accept it. You only have to fix end consumer prices. And this is one of the many parallels to Russia's economy today. Russia got more and more international loans while at the same time ruining their own ability to pay back that money without taking on new loans. And compounding these problems was the brain drain, meaning the most productive Russian citizens left the country, went to the United States for the most part, or to Europe, where you could be productive in the economy, where you find other people who have this mentality of creating more value. Gaddy explains a specific example, which is farming in Russia. Mega corporations have almost taken over this entire sector. So the only thing that is not a mega corporation is these very, very small farms, and they only produce pretty much what those families need to feed themselves. There's not enough production to sell on the market, have a profit, and then start growing. So this sort of thing is happening elsewhere too. So it's not just these small farms, it's also smaller factories that make things that people use every day. They don't really compete with the bigger corporations, and they can compete with international products. They don't really make profits, but they make things and they sort of sell things for people close to that factory. And this is how quite a bit of the economy looks like. If you have an economy like this, the official numbers don't really mean anything. So the economy seems to be growing, and these numbers are being used internationally to attract investors and to get new loans, but this is not reality. That's why this Brookings guy called it the virtual Russian economy. That's a nice way of saying the mostly fake Russian economy. So the Russian economy wasn't really growing, it was contracting, it was shrinking, and Russia took that risk. They preferred an economic contraction, preferred it to having a more Western type economy, a more healthy economy, with many companies actually creating new value. And in 1999, Clifford Getty at Brookings predicted that we're just, in the West, we're just helping Russia along a certain way. They're not developing in a good direction. They're not becoming more like us. But at some point, there's going to be international tensions, which the Russians need as an empire, as a regime, which the regime in Russia needs to move things towards a centralized command economy. At first, there won't be total coercion everywhere, but at some point, coercion will become the new norm. So that means the government orders you to learn a certain thing or to work at a certain place for a certain amount of time, a certain amount of money or goods, and maybe you get 2 or 3 choices. So you can pick career A, B, or C, but that's it. And this is where things are heading. So now we saw Valentina Matvienko, high-ranking Russian government official, close ally to President Putin. And she recently talked about the railroad system in Russia, and private companies now basically have to work for the state. They can't be selfish. They can't just have money making as their goal. They have to work for the greater good now. And they call this new economy a mobilizing economy. Now, what exactly does that mean? Are they mobilizing for a grand war or a grand Cold War? We're going to see about that. So they don't want transparency in anything. So what's a work hour worth? What is the average life worth? What are certain goods worth? Everything is going to be basically secret, and the government can dictate those phony, virtual, fake prices. So the government controls quality, the government controls price, and they will regulate things to further the regime and not to further the causes of the Russian people. The Russian elite has built these new palaces where they live in. And those palaces, they look like European palaces from the Middle Ages, like the European aristocracies and monarchies. And those palaces looked exactly like older Roman Empire palaces. So we can seem to shake the old Roman traditions, right? So 10% upper class, and of course those 10% are heavily segregated as well, but it's 10%, and then you have the rest. You have the 90% where life just isn't good. Now, many people don't actually know this, especially in America. They don't really know this, but 90% of our ancestors, the European ancestors, 90% of them were farming serfs. A serf is not a full slave, but it's pretty close to that. You had to do all the hard farming work with all the risks involved. Every day of the year, you had to work and then have your grain taken away from you. And every Sunday, you were expected to go to church, a really corrupt church, and they would tell you that Jesus really likes the fact that you're a serf and you will be rewarded later. Any type of regime will do these things, no matter if they market themselves as Roman tradition or European Middle Age tradition or socialism or fascism or whatever you want to call these things. It's always the same thing. In reality, in the real world, socialism was nothing more than overtaxation and over-regulation.